Expression, Awareness, and Thought Society, Latin American Studies Program, Spanish Department, Cuban and American Student Association, Sociology Department. And we'd like to thank all of our co-sponsors. And right now I want to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. His name is Professor Milton Vickerman, and he's actually one of our own from our Sociology Department here at UVA. He actually received his PhD from New York University in 1992 and joined the University of Virginia in 1994. He's a professor, as I mentioned, in sociology, and his main areas of research are race, immigration, and processes of minority adaptation to American society. So that's what he's going to focus on in our lecture. And he has, most recently he's actually written a work on immigration and assimilation for the Virginia Journal of Social Policy and the Law. And he's also written extensively on West Indian immigrants, predominantly on Jamaica, Jamaican immigrants rather, to the United States. One of his most recent publications is his book, West Indian Cross Currents in West Indian Immigration and Race. And he also teaches many courses here at UVA, including race and ethnic relations. He also teaches a course in immigration and sociology. You all may recognize some of these courses. And we're definitely very pleased to have him here as part of this event. And thank you, Professor Vickerman, for having taken out time on your Saturday. We appreciate that. So would you all definitely join me in welcoming Professor Vickerman and thanking him for being here.
So I've been asked to give a talk on race and migration in the Caribbean. And so that's a very tall order, because we're talking about a lot of data, obviously, and a very long time period. So I have to compress all of that, I think, into 40 minutes. Okay, so we'll see how that goes. First thing that I should mention, so when we talk about these two things, so we're talking about race and migration in the Caribbean, we're talking about dynamic variables. And it's very important to actually point that out, because it's actually very surprising, it's amazing actually, how many representations present the Caribbean as a static entity, okay? And this is especially true if you watch film, for example. A couple of years ago I did some research actually on representations of West Indians in film, and it was amazing to me just how these films tended to present certain very stock images, plantations, southern slaves, etc., and zombies. I mean, zombies are all over the place in these movies. It's amazing, But actually, the Caribbean is a changing place, okay? So what I'd like to do today, three things. First off, I want to consider conceptually what race means, and secondly, to apply this understanding to the Caribbean, and third, to consider the ways in which migration may or may not have interacted with notions of race relations over time. Because the thing is that in some instances, migration has directly impacted notions of race in the Caribbean. In other periods or at other times, it's been a very indirect sort of relationship, okay? So there's a great deal of variation. So the first thing I'd like to do then, as I said, is to just briefly set the stage, right? So conceptually, what is race? What are we talking about? So I talk about this all the time in my race class. Basically, if you look at just the landscape of race in Western culture over the past 500 years, you'll see that for most of that period, people have had this very essentialist notion of race, okay? So it's been the idea that people are essentially this or that, with physical features being merely sort of convenient way of representing supposedly what these people intrinsically are, okay? That's been the notion of race has ruled for a long time in Western culture. So it's been this notion of essentialism and also the notion of hierarchy, that because people are essentially one thing or another, some groups are inherently superior and other groups are inherently inferior. So that idea reigned certainly in the 19th century, picked up steam after Darwin published Origin of the Species in 1859. Scientific racism became really important, reached its high point at the end of the Second World War. The Nazis sort of took this idea to its logical conclusion. Essentially what happened was that the after effects of the Second World War were so dramatic that the notion of race as biology just really lost all credibility, and also the other side of that was that just intellectually it was very hard to justify. So after the Second World War, with this notion that race as biology disappeared, and instead it was replaced by the idea of race being a social construction, okay? So the point I'm actually making here is that when we think about race in the Caribbean, that's the way we have to look at it, right? That race is primarily a social notion, okay? Because actually the Caribbean illustrates this. It's sort of like prime example number one of this notion of social race, okay? But having said that, then we have to define what we mean by social race. What does that mean exactly? It's quite different from the notion of race as biology. To say that race is primarily social is to say that a race is a group that's defined by a particular society using criteria that that society views as being particularly important, usually biological criteria, okay? So this doesn't mean that biology becomes unimportant. What it means, however, is that biology becomes secondary, that the meanings to be derived from phenotype, various biological facts are not self-evident. Instead, what we have is a situation where society imposes certain meanings on that biology, okay? Sort of like, I always illustrate this in my class on race, by sort of drawing this parallel between race and, notions of beauty, for example. So let's say that you were to take, say, two women, right? A blonde woman and a brunette, okay? You put them next to each other. Now, question is, what does that mean intrinsically? I mean, what meaning can we derive from the fact that one woman is blonde, the other one is brunette? Nothing, really. But we know that actually society gives different meanings to those things, right? What I'm saying is that those meanings are imposed by society, okay? So, really what I'm leading up to is this, that to say that race is primarily social has some really important implications. And perhaps the most important of these is that race then becomes relative, okay, to a large extent, right? Race becomes this flexible thing that can actually change over time, for sure, okay? Changes historically, and it also changes to a certain extent from society to society. And we definitely see that if we look at the Caribbean, okay? Now, in the United States, the prime example of this notion of social race, of course, is the infamous one-drop rule, right, which I'm sure you've all heard of, right? The rule of hypodescent. It's the idea here in America that a black person is any individual with any amount of African ancestry, regardless of what that person looks like. So I always tell students, well, say, compare, for example, you all know who Keanu Reeves is? Neo. Dangerous. I love that movie. Keanu can't act, poor guy, but he looked good in the movie. So what race is Keanu Reeves? What do you think?
White.
Most people would say he's white. He's actually white and Asian, right? But he gets shunted into the white group. Compare him, for example, to say Halle Berry. What race is she? People see her as black, and she sees herself as black, but logically, she's just as white as she's black, right? Her mother is English, right? The point I'm making here is that society has made this arbitrary kind of distinction between these two people. Okay? Anyway, so that's just the United States. We can look at many other examples. What I want to do, though, is to move on to the Caribbean situation, because what I'm arguing here, actually, is that when we look at race in the Caribbean, we're definitely looking at this notion of race as a social construction. But to do that, first thing that we have to do, oops, let's see here. Oh, so this is my map of the Caribbean, as if you didn't really know what it is exactly. Is that actually we have to define what we mean, precisely what we mean by the term Caribbean. And actually that's not as straightforward as you might think. It's actually a kind of controversial term. I mean, different people define it differently. Okay, you know, you can define it very narrowly. So some people talk about, say, the West Indies. Defined narrowly, or really they're focusing on, say, the British West Indies in that instance, or you can define it very broadly. So actually today, I'm taking a very broad view of this notion of Caribbean, drawing upon this really, in a way, strange book by a Dutch writer called Harmonis Hotenk. I'm not sure if you've heard of this. This book, it's, the name of the book is Two Variants of Caribbean Race Relations. And actually, as I said, it's a little bit strange in some ways, right, because of the way that he writes this book. But he actually introduces some good ideas. So one thing that Hotenk does in this book is he defines Caribbean very broadly, actually, to include on the one end of it the southern United States. Okay, so for him, Caribbean is everything from the southern U.S. all the way down to the northern portions of South America. So very, very broad definition. And so that's broad, but it's actually pretty useful because it allows us to see the full range of possible racial variation that takes place within this Caribbean region. And so this is what I've done here in this typology, where I'm trying to illustrate in simplified form the various sort of combinations, permutations one sees in this Caribbean region. So this goes from type 1 to type 3 with, you know, sort of subsidiary types in between. Actually, most of these are pretty straightforward except for type 2B80, but I'll get to that. So, now notice I've entitled this a typology of classic Caribbean race relations. That's important, right? Because I'm talking about what has, how people have viewed things historically. Okay? Now, the other point I'm making too, though, is that to a certain extent, some of this has changed, right? So this is more like a classic perception of how race is in the Caribbean. So if we see the American pole as being, example as being one pole, one type of race relations, in the Caribbean, sort of like the northernmost extension of it, so that would be type 1, right? Where classically, we've had a very dichotomized kind of society, right? Literally a black-white society. Now, not saying that other groups haven't existed in America, obviously, that they haven't been important. Okay, that's not at all what I'm saying. But we all know that historically in America, the race in this country has been very dichotomized, right, for various reasons. We could get into the reasons, but it's been a very, very strict kind of situation. So that's one end of the spectrum, right? We've had a strict division between blacks and whites, essentially a two-tiered society. Certainly, this is what has happened, has pertained in the South for the longest while. I mean, the question in the sociological literature now, actually, quite frankly, which I'm not going to get into, is to what extent is, you know, what you see here in type 1 still representative of race relations, especially in the South. Won't go there, but for sure, this is how it's been classically. On the other end of the spectrum, we have type 3, right? Type 3, type race relations, and what's known as the Iberian or the Latin American variant, okay? And this variant has been classified by a very tiered kind of society, okay, with whites being dominant, okay, a black population at the bottom, okay, and a mixed race or mulatto group in between. Now, the interesting thing about this particular variant, okay, is that it tends to put a great deal of stress on this mixed race group, which goes by different names, right? So people in Latin American countries have several different names, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. The idea generally has been that this mixed race group is centrally important because those societies have encouraged people in this group to essentially act as sort of transmitters from the black group to the white group. And the idea has been that, you know, if you're born black, okay, you need not stay there for the rest of your life. Okay, you can, in a way, become white, okay, by progressively, you know, mixing, etc. So that the boundaries between the mixed race group in type 3 now and the white group in the Iberian variant has actually been quite permeable, right? Definitely been very permeable because many mixed race people in this middle group here in type 3 have actually filtered into the white group at the top. And at the bottom you also have, again, sort of this hazy kind of, you know, boundary. So the way to understand this is to compare type 3, which is at sort of the most liberal end of the mixing spectrum, with type 1, which is the strictest, okay, variant in this situation, where, so the idea in type 1, the American situation, the North American situation, is that it's been impossible to move between these two groups classically, right? So it's really been very much of a, so many sociologists have described what has existed in the American South as being a caste system, right? And classically, what caste has meant is a situation where you've had this hierarchical society where individuals who are born at the bottom of those societies are fixed in their status. They have not been able to move. Of course, we've had passing, but that's been sort of very undercover, right? So people have passed in the United States, but it's been sort of very discreet, you know, etc. Whereas in the Iberian variant, mixing is actively encouraged. The idea is that people should mix, okay? So before I continue, let me just point out some similarities here, because clearly, if you look at the implications of what I'm saying, you'll see that in both number 1, type 1 and type 3, blackness is essentially seen as being a bad thing, okay? So I'm not making the argument that somehow there's no racism or race doesn't matter in the Iberian variant. It definitely does matter, and racism does exist. It's just that in some ways there's a more liberal perception, okay? So that the idea then is, yes, you're black, but you can maybe change that over a period of time, whereas in type 1, the idea was you're black, but, well, that's it. You know, it's fixed, right? There's nothing you can do about it. So that in between that, as I said, here we have type 2, which I label the Northwestern European variant, which is typically what one will find in places like Jamaica, for example, or Grenada, places like that. And you'll see that it's kind of similar in some ways to the Iberian variant, in the sense that there definitely is also a mixed group right in the middle, right? Small white elite, okay? Somewhat larger mixed group, and a very large black population at the bottom. The difference between type 2 and type 3 is that the type 2 situation is more fixed than the type 3 situation. In other words, in countries like Jamaica, historically, while there's been a mixed race group, the barriers between mixed race people and blacks and whites have tended to be firmer than has been the case in the Iberian or Latin American societies. So that's the reason I have it in the middle, because in some ways it's a bit like the situation in America, but it's also like the situation in Latin America. In other words, it combines features of both of these situations, okay? So those are the three standard models. Now, so then I have type 2A, which I refer to as Northwestern European Caribbean 2. And the examples here are countries like Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, which are, so Trinidad and Guyana. Guyana is in South America, but it's really a Caribbean country. It's not culturally, historically, it's Caribbean, it's not South American at all. Suriname is similar, but Dutch. Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, very similar to each other and different than places like Jamaica, Grenada, for example, in that you have many more racial groups. If you go to Jamaica, for example, basically what you're dealing with are blacks and whites, historically, okay? You go to Trinidad, what you're dealing with is blacks, whites, Indians, Chinese, some Europeans from other parts of the world. In Suriname, it gets even more complicated because there you threw the Javanese in, okay? And so, in other words, you have more groups to work from, so the possible combinations, okay, become more. You get a more complex kind of race relations in places like Trinidad and Guyana, okay? Definitely more complex than what exists in Jamaica, more overt, okay, and in some ways more problematic. So that's why so basically what I'm saying is that type 2A is a modification of type 2. Type 2B, I label Haiti, and quite frankly, this is problematic, right? Haiti is very problematic because it's different than actually every other Caribbean country in the sense that it's the only territory in the classical period where you had a situation where the mulatto group took power, right? In every other situation, the mulatto group tended to be intermediate between whites and blacks, right? But because of the Haitian Revolution, which is incredibly, difficult, a lot of turmoil, eventually the mulatto group took power and essentially have dominated Haiti for a very long time, okay? So I think we have to see this as being yet another variation on that theme, okay? All right, so let me continue here. Okay, so if we turn to the question of migration, because I'm trying to put these two ideas together in some way, what I said was that, so migration has impacted notions of race in the Caribbean, but I need to frame that better, actually. Because if we look at racial change in the Caribbean, what we'll find is that migration, while important, actually has been only one of several factors that have actually impacted notions of race historically, okay? So if we're looking at the ways in which race has changed, or notions of race have changed in the Caribbean, we have to look at the following factors. I'm not going to do all of these, but these are the really crucial factors here. Decolonization, economic growth, social turmoil, like crime, for example, globalization, internal capital accumulation, and migration. And migration becomes one of only several, a number of these factors. But that's the one I want to focus on today. Well, why focus on migration? Well, because migration, or put it another way, a friend of mine said one time, he said to me, one thing we know about Caribbean people is that they move. Okay? They're always migrating, okay? It's a region where migration is very, very entrenched within, actually just the whole basin. Okay, so it's actually quite important. So if we look at migration, okay, we can make a couple of generalizations. First off, with respect to the Caribbean, what we find is that most migration actually has been external. So we've had migration that's internal to the Caribbean, but we've also had migration external in the sense of Caribbean peoples trying to move out of these regions, of the region. And what I'm saying is that if you look at the balance in terms of the numbers, okay, most of this has been external. I just looked up some numbers. The UN published this document recently in which it's argued that over the past 50 years, perhaps 5 million people have migrated out of the Caribbean. Of that number, only 10% has occurred within the region, so only about 500,000 people, okay? So, in other words, internal migration is somewhat secondary. And actually, I have some numbers here. Okay, so again, so we have this internal migration being not as, well, it's actually quite important, but number-wise, it's been, less than external migration. Nevertheless, migration within the region has been quite important. So the other point I need to make with respect to migration is that when we look at the internal situation, we definitely find that some countries are receivers and other countries in the region are senders, okay? So in other words, there are places in the Caribbean, if we look at it internally, where people are migrating to, and there are countries that are not receiving any migrants at all. And this is what this diagram here is showing. What we see here is that the Cayman Islands, Anguilla, British Virgin Islands, you can see the whole list, right? These are regions of the Caribbean that are tending to attract migrants. And the graph here is showing the percentage of the populations of those countries that's composed of migrants. So look at the Cayman Islands, for example, about 40% of people living in the Cayman Islands are migrants. On the other hand, compare that to countries like Trinidad, Dominican Republic, Suriname, Jamaica, Haiti, Guyana. These countries have very small migrant populations. People are not migrating into these countries, they're migrating out of these countries. Actually, I'm simplifying things because some countries are both receivers and senders, right? But I'm really simplifying it here. But again, actually I looked at the numbers last night. For 2005, only 0.7% of the Jamaican population, okay, is migrant. There are very few migrants in Jamaica, okay? On the other hand, as I said, we can tell where migrants are leaving from. Okay? They're leaving from these countries. This is a calculation that's known as the emigration rate, which is a rate that's calculated taking the number of people leaving divided by the population of these countries, right? And so when you do that, what you get is a sense of the likelihood that people are going to leave from particular countries and go to other countries. And when you do that rate, what you find is an extreme likelihood of people leaving places like Guyana. You can see the bars here, right? Guyana, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So then we find that, differential movement within the region. What's also happened, okay, bearing that in mind, is that different countries have been, if we're looking at racial change in the Caribbean and trying to connect that to migration, what we find is that some countries have been impacted more than other countries by migration. So I go back to a point I made at the beginning, which is that if we connect these two factors, racial change and migration, we find that some countries have been impacted directly by migration in a way that has changed their racial structures and actually more to the point of racial relations, whereas other countries have experienced more indirect change as a result of migration. And actually a third reality, unfortunately, is that in some countries, migration has only tended to further intensify social inequalities revolving around race. Okay? So I'd like to talk about all of these examples. I'd like to discuss some of these principles by focusing on Jamaica and the Haiti situation. Okay? We look at Jamaica as an example of a country where migration is sort of very entrenched historically. What we find here is the following story. So Jamaica, being a British territory, received its independence, not independence, sorry, slaves were freed in 1838, okay? Following that period, for about, I guess, 12, 15 years or so, what you had was a situation where former slaves essentially abandoned plantations and sort of went inland. They became peasants, right, on hillsides. About in the 1850s, you started to see the first large movement of Jamaicans outside, movement of Jamaican migrants. And they largely went to Panama for the building of the Panama Canal Railroad, okay? So it was this, they're constructing this railroad in Panama. In the 1880s, we saw the first attempt at the construction of the Panama Canal, right, a French-led construction, and you had huge numbers of Jamaicans moving out into that, and then after that there was a second attempt, the American-led attempt, again attracted huge numbers of Jamaicans. Now, the point I'm actually making here is this, that in this first period, again focusing on Jamaicans, this first period of Jamaican migration, which essentially was within the region, right, because they were moving from Jamaica to Panama, we saw a couple of things. Large numbers of people leaving the island, but this actually did not directly affect race relations in Jamaica at all, right? There really was no direct impact on immigrants leaving Jamaica and the racial structures that existed in Jamaican society. You're still dealing with a colonial society where whites dominated. You had this small mixed race group and large poor black group, okay? So if we continue past that, what we find after the Panama Canal construction in the 1919, 1920, lots of Jamaicans moved from Jamaica to Cuba, right, called sugar cane. Then following that, at the same time, we had large numbers moving to the United States. Trying to hit the high points of Jamaican migration here historically. And then following the Second World War, you had like huge numbers of Jamaicans leaving Jamaica, going to the United Kingdom. Okay? None of that actually directly impacted race relations. However, there was an indirect effect of this migration on Jamaica's social structure, because the other thing that you need to know about migration in the Caribbean is that it's very transnational. Right? It's very circulatory. That is to say, immigrants don't just simply leave and disappear, they have a tendency to come back, right? So they've been doing this for a very long time, and this is how we start to see some of the sort of feedback effects that migration has had in a country like Jamaica. So some of those immigrants who left in this early period, right, certainly near the beginning of the 20th century, they came back. And they came back with ideas that seemed to the colonial authorities as subversive. I'm thinking here particularly about Marcus Garvey, right? It was very important. He would travel around the Caribbean, had gone to the United States, and he came back to Jamaica preaching notions of black power, black supremacy. I mean, in a colonial society, this is heresy. Right? So Marcus Garvey was not well received when he came back to Jamaica. Actually, he was severely persecuted. And his ideas did not directly lead to changes in, again, race relations in Jamaica. But nevertheless, they tended to be very significant over the long run, right? Because what they did was that they started to filter out into the culture, especially into the poorer sections of Jamaican society. Eventually, Garveyism led to Rastafarianism, okay? Which in Jamaican history has been, and culture has been very significant. Now, so very few Jamaicans are Rastafarians. I mean, like a tiny percentage of the population, but culturally, it's been a very, very strong force because of its focus on sort of black power and going back to Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm saying here is that this is a really good example of indirect change resulting from migration, because it took a very long time, right? This change that has occurred over a long period of time. What Garveyism and more to the point Rastafarianism has done in Jamaica is that over several decades it has tended to strongly oppose notions of sort of white supremacy and that sort of thing. Okay? See, one of the factors that binds the three models that I mentioned before, as Hoteng points out in his book, is that Caribbean societies historically have tended to have what sociologists refer to as a white bias, right? They tend to idealize things European. Now, Hoteng in his book focuses particularly on something he refers to as the somatic norm image, by which he means the idea that the white phenotype, or European phenotype in particular, has been very, very influential in terms of you know, how sort of Caribbean people view what is best, you know, how people should be, etc. But it actually is more than this phenotype. It's that, but it's also culture. It's the idea that, you know, European culture, Western culture is sort of the ideal. It is sort of what people should aspire towards. What I'm saying here is that Garveyism and Rastafarianism has strongly opposed that, but it's taken a very long time, right? So it's not been a direct kind of change in the social structure. But actually, Jamaica also demonstrates that migration can have a direct change on the social structure. In the 1970s, Michael Manley came to power in Jamaica, okay? Manley was definitely of this mixed race group, okay? He was, I mean, actually, he could easily have passed for white in America. You know, he came, put it this way, he came to my school one time. I was in high school, and he gave a talk. At the end of the talk, I swear the girls were swooning, right? All I could hear was, "He's so handsome," like, you know, end of the story, right? The thing is, so Manley was a socialist who, you know, was very committed to that, and he wanted to make major changes in Jamaican society. Now, whether or not he actually would have done that is another story. But what happened was that there's a lot of backlash against Manley in Jamaica in the 1970s, essentially because of, you know, his policies, the kind of things that you know, he believed in. Lots and lots of people started migrating out of Jamaica, right? Mainly middle class, sort of mixed race people. And that's actually a very significant thing in Jamaican society, because what happened was that their leaving actually opened up slots in society that were very rapidly filled by poorer Jamaicans. So what you had after Manley, this was an unintended effect, because the sort of brown middle class left and went to places like Miami especially, you had this upward mobility out of, you know, poor black areas, right? So people moving into places like Beverly Hills and Kingston, these, you know, fancy kinds of neighborhoods. So that was a situation where you definitely saw migration having a direct impact on, you know, the social structure, because essentially Manley opened up a situation that allowed poor blacks to gain a voice, and they gained that voice primarily because so many middle class, sort of mixed or brown Jamaicans left the island. Okay? That was a more direct situation. If we turn to the case of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, there we have a situation where migration is very, very important. But rather than actually ameliorating the racial sort of inequalities that exist between those two islands, migration actually merely has cemented it, okay? Made it ever stronger, actually. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the situation in Hispaniola. Basically what you have is huge islands split between 1/3 of it is historically French, Haiti, okay? The other 2/3, Santo Domingo, Spanish, okay? Haiti was one of the premier plantation colonies in the Caribbean. Okay? Very brutal colonial regime, French regime rule there. Santo Domingo, ruled by the Spanish, was not quite as, I mean, slavery was there, but it wasn't quite as entrenched as in Haiti. Okay? Essentially, the way things worked out historically is that Haiti has become the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. In Haiti, you're talking about extreme levels of poverty, right? So many of these Caribbean countries are poor, but Haiti is on a different dimension of poverty, right? Really bad situation. So what this has meant is that, okay, so we know that most migration has economic causes. So Haitians are trying to leave, and right, who wouldn't? They're trying to make their lives better. And they've migrated to various places out of the Caribbean, or they've tried to. But certainly, logically, one thing they've tried to do is to move to the Dominican Republic because it's literally right next door. Okay? So it actually makes sense from an economic point of view. The problem, though, is that Dominicans very much despise Haitians. Okay? Basically, in the Dominican Republic, what you have is a population that's largely mixed race, that has defined itself in opposition to the Haitian population. So most Haitians are very dark-skinned, clearly of African ancestry. Dominicans are also African ancestry, to a large extent, but they tend to deny it, right? And they deny it, I think, primarily because of the poverty in Haiti, the extremes of degradation that one finds there. So Haitians moving to the Dominican Republic essentially move into this situation of subservience. It's a situation where social inequality revolving around race has become entrenched, right? It is sort of to the point now where it's sort of functional for Dominicans to in a way degrade Haitians, quite frankly, right? Because it's a very strange kind of situation where the Dominican Republic depends on low-cost Haitian labor to feed its plantation machinery, to work in the construction industry, basically to do low-cost menial labor, the kind of labor that we find undocumented immigrants doing in the United States, right? So Dominicans depend on Haitians to do that, but at the same time, they despise them. And they routinely round them up, okay, occasionally send them back to Haiti, or there have been periods like in 1937 when Trujillo was dictator. He massacred like 15,000 Haitians. So this has been going on for a very, very long time. The point I'm trying to make here is that there you have a situation where migration is actually entrenched, because there's, I don't see a situation, a time when this is going to end anytime soon, because again, migration is economic in nature. People migrate because they're trying to better their lives. Actually, most people migrate from poor countries to countries that are maybe only slightly poorer, right? So it's not what we think of as being like necessarily poor to very wealthy, right? It's like poor to somewhat less poor. That's what we see in the situation. The Haitians are going to continue to go to the Dominican Republic, but unfortunately, they're going to continue to be subordinated, to be mistreated. Okay? They're locked in this sort of cycle. Okay? And there's also a lot of corruption taking place. So it turns out that, you know, it's not just Haitians moving in illegally, but the Dominican government itself has institutionalized the process. You also have a situation where the Dominican army has been essentially either inducing Haitians to come to the Dominican Republic or kidnapping them and bringing them there. But it's actually very ironic, because even while this is taking place, guess what? Thousands of Dominicans are leaving the Dominican Republic and moving to the United States, but they do so largely by way of Puerto Rico, across the Mona Strait, right? And so Dominicans go to Puerto Rico because that's an easy way of getting into the United States, because Puerto Ricans are American citizens, right? They don't necessarily need documents to come, so it's hard from American authorities on the mainland. Are you Puerto Rican or are you Dominican? Who knows, right? The thing is, when the Dominicans get to Puerto Rico, what they find is that Puerto Ricans very much treat them the way they treat Haitians. It's a very ironic situation, so that the Dominicans in Puerto Rico have become this sort of, not necessarily an underclass, but definitely a subordinated population living in urban ghettos in the Dominican Republic. At the same time, you also have Cubans who have migrated to Puerto Rico, but the Cubans do much better. The Cubans have become an elite within Puerto Rican society, right? They do very well in the same way that they've done well in South Florida, okay? So again, you see this kind of movement taking place. I guess the Dominican Puerto Rican situation would be one actually where racial subordination is being replicated in some ways. It's being replicated there, as I said, the way it's being replicated in the Dominican Republic. I think I'll stop here and maybe take questions if people have questions.
You spoke about how the Dominican government often rounds up Haitians and sends them back to Haiti, but I heard that they often do it the other way around, they'll go in and kind of recruit Haitian farmers, sugarcane farmers or something. They'll go in and basically kidnap a group of people to work sugar canes, and then kind of put them in sort of
they live in ghettos on the outskirts of the plantation. So actually, it turns out it's not either or. Both things are taking place. That's the reason I said it's an ironic situation, because in fact they are inducing them to migrate into the Dominican Republic, because the Haitians do work that Dominicans don't want to do. Right? Now, I mean, this is not necessarily racial. I mean, we see the same thing happening in highly industrialized countries, right? Where once those countries reach a certain level of development, the citizens of those countries refuse to do certain kinds of work. This is why we have Turks in Germany, for example, or why we have Mexican laborers in the United States, right? So it's the same kind of economic kind of motive, but it's an ironic situation because both things are happening. They're recruiting them, but they occasionally feel a need to expel them as well. It's this love-hate relationship, very schizophrenic.
I guess my question is more, is the active pursuing of this on behalf of the government, is that still very present? Does the government still actively encourage this sort of back and forth?
Yes. They do, because again, their economy depends on low-cost labor. Somebody has to do the work, and Haitians are desperate, so they will do the work.
So you were talking about, when you were going through diagrams, kind of this is historically how it looks as far as the mixed populations and some of them in between. So is that mix now changing, or is it still pretty firm as far as, is that getting complicated now that we're having more migration?
Well,
Is that,
so the question is where?
yeah.
Because I glossed over a tremendous amount, actually. So in some countries, the situation has become definitely more complex, and in other places it doesn't seem to have changed very much.
So
In Jamaica, for example, it's reached a point now where just notions of blackness are so strong in terms of countering these historical memories. People in Jamaica don't talk about race. They don't even think about race, because for them, blackness is normal, the way whiteness is normal in America. They don't think about that. I mean, what they think about is the difficulties of making a living in a poor, dependent economy. That's what they're concerned about on a day-to-day basis, right? So race it still matters, but it matters in a very sort of subtle, underground sort of way. On the other hand, in a country like Trinidad, race is more important, I think, on a day-to-day basis because of essentially what you have there, tensions between blacks and Indians, right? Where how it worked out for the past couple of decades is that the blacks, starting with people like Eric Williams, took political power and sort of could control the political machinery, whereas Indians essentially took control of the economy. So you have this sort of parallel structure, right? Now it's shifted a bit, so Indians have taken power. But it looks, because say Trinidad is split evenly between these two populations. So I think for the foreseeable future, you will have a situation where there's going to be conflict there. Right? So Indians don't necessarily see themselves as being aligned with blacks. I mean, it's complex because they're in a culture where they all see themselves as being Trinidadian, and they hold that very dear, right? And it pretty much depends on the particular situation you're talking about. So when Trinidadians go to a place like Jamaica, they pretty much see themselves as Trinidadians, and they interact with each other very much. In Trinidad, I'm sure they interact as well, but there tends to be more of a sense of group identity, right? So that's just two situations. If you look at a country like Aruba, which is Dutch, okay, you see changes taking place actually because of immigration. What's happening in Aruba, you have lots of South Americans moving in there from Venezuela, from Colombia, because it has a booming economy. These immigrants are forming another tier in society. So this low-level working class tier, consisting of these immigrants. And so it's I guess you could say it's changing Aruban society by adding another level, making the society ever more complex.
Just to follow up on that really quick, is race becoming more salient in areas like Jamaica and these really high moving tourist areas just because of like influx of because just being there, it seems like race is salient just because of the white tourist population. But is that just a different type of attention?
I don't know if I'd say that tourism in Jamaica is being raised more salient. My impression is that the tourist areas are like these little enclaves where the people who serve the tourists are very calculating in the way they approach tourists, right?
Yeah.
They pretty much they're trying to make money. So they will do things that please tourists so they can make money, right? Probably the more important factor would be sort of American media in terms of, impact it's having on Jamaican society. So Jamaica is actually a very Americanized place. It still has that British substrate, but it definitely is quite Americanized. But I don't know if that necessarily has impacted notions of race in particular. Right? Just in Jamaica, Jamaicans are not very, right, they're just, I guess you'd say, not very open about racial issues, and they're very sort of proud of their black heritage, actually. But these notions of white bias still exist. There's no doubt about it. I'm not saying that they don't exist, but again, it's that influence of Rastafarianism. That's, whether or not Jamaicans would actually admit to that is another issue, but it's definitely now strongly sort of opposing these historical notions of white bias, for sure.
I admire your willingness to undertake such a hard chore, generalizing on such a diversity of places, and I'm sorry I came in late. But in looking at this chart, there are two things that strike me. One, the noticeable absence of Barbados, which is sort of a major exporter regions of the Anglophone Caribbean.
Right.
And given the fact that Guadeloupeans and Martiniquans are French citizens and go to France in droves and droves and droves, I'm surprised to find that these two islands are so far down on the bottom of your list of migrating countries.
They're not immigrating when they go to France. You're going from one to France.
Right. Well, actually, so I crunched the numbers. I crunched the numbers, and this is actually the way it came out. Well, so you're actually right. I should have been more precise because this is the immigration rate, and I'm basing this not on immigrants. Well, on immigrants migrating to the United States. So that's the reason why Guadeloupe and Martinique are so low down on this list.
Okay.
So in other words, I'm not looking at total migration out of these countries. Right?
So it actually should read likelihood of migrating from particular Caribbean countries
into
to
the United States. Right. Yeah. So I should have been more precise in that. So you're correct in that if I had done the total migration from these countries to every single region of the globe, right, you might see a different sort of mix. My guess actually is that the top tier countries probably would not change very much.
Well, then Puerto Rico should be right on top.
Well, the thing with Puerto Rico is that it's actually very hard to come up with data on Puerto Rico. Migration is surprisingly difficult. Right? But you're correct. I mean, Puerto Rico would be near the top because, in fact, it does send large numbers to the United States. So I would agree that if Puerto Rico were in there, it would be near the top for sure. But what I'm saying is that Guyana, Grenada, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Dominican Republic, those countries, even if you were to toss in migration to other parts of the world, they still would be where they are now because actually most of that migration is to the United States.
I actually had a question about where Haiti is on the chart. I was very surprised, and I'm wondering, is it so low on the chart because of the fact that much of the immigration is going on from one side of the island to the other? Or is that based on including immigration to the Dominican Republic?
I think, yeah, I was a little surprised myself when I crunched these numbers because I had expected Haiti to be higher.
Me too.
I think this is partially reflecting the difficulty that Haitians have getting into the United States, right? So you probably have like higher Haitian immigration than this might actually imply.
Right.
Okay, Haitians are in a very difficult situation because they're one of the only two Caribbean groups who come into the United States as refugees, right? So they're facing a lot of obstacles where those that's concerned. But actually, again, I expected Haiti when I did this calculation to be higher.
I heard that historically there's been a lot of animosity towards the Chinese immigrants in Jamaica. And I was wondering, and I know that during the Black Power movement in the 1970s that the Chinese in Jamaica became this sort of silent minority. They didn't want to make waves. They just kind of wanted to be invisible. And I was wondering if that was still the case today.
The Chinese in Jamaica are a classic middleman minority. The Chinese were brought in along with Indians at the end of slavery by plantation owners who were afraid that slaves, rightly so, would leave the plantation. They did leave the plantation, so they brought Indians in. Indians actually did, to a certain extent, substitute for blacks. The Chinese didn't like that kind of work. They went into the grocery business. And so that is where the hostility actually emerged because they were in the middleman minority situation. So that, I guess I'd say that it just so happens that the Chinese occupy that particular position, but if another group had been there, they would have faced sort of similar hostility, because that is a sort of typical situation that middleman minorities, regardless of where they happen to be or who they happen to be, face, right? But you're right. I mean, there has been hostility. On the other hand, though, the Chinese in Jamaica are Jamaican. I mean, I have Chinese relatives, right? And if you talk to them, they'll say, well, I'm not Chinese, I'm Jamaican. They're very integrated into society. I think it's very instructive to compare, on this issue, to compare Jamaica with a country like Trinidad or Guyana. The difference between these countries, is that Jamaica only has a very small Chinese population, very small. Distinct, but it's very small. It tends to be larger in Trinidad and in Guyana. The size actually has helped them to assimilate much better. In Jamaica, for sure. So Chinese actually in Jamaica tend to be quite wealthy. They have, remember I talked about in the 1970s, you had this upward mobility taking place. The Chinese definitely benefited from that, right? Their control of, when you think, in Jamaica, when you think of grocery, you automatically think Chinese. They control it 100%. And they've been able to use that, the lock on that business to accumulate capital to leverage themselves in society. So some Jamaican social scientists actually argue that the Chinese in Jamaica are now white, actually, right? So there is hostility, but the last time that there was any real racial conflict involving the Chinese in Jamaica was in the 1960s, right? That hasn't happened in a very long time. I guess there are no more questions.
If you all want to go, okay. So let's join me in thanking Professor Vickerman for his. If you all like, you can go ahead and grab something from the back. We're going to do that part very quickly so that we can move on to Professor Martinez's lecture, which is going to talk about Haiti-Dominican Republic relations. So kind of pulling off the theme that we ended on with our lecture with Professor Vickerman.
Oh, sorry.